All right, so today we're diving into something that I think is super relevant to a lot of people out there, especially with how crazy the housing market has been these days. We're talking tenant rights in different U.S. states, just a comparison of how things shake out across the country.
Yeah, definitely. It's wild how much things can change depending on, literally just crossing a state line.
Right, like what you can expect from your landlord, what you're legally entitled to as a renter, all that stuff, it just shifts completely. And we've got some really interesting sources here, like breaking down the actual laws and how these differences can play out in real life for renters.
Yeah, and I think for anyone renting or thinking about renting, getting a handle on this is huge. This is your home we're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ugh.
So in this deep dive, let's try to get a clear picture of just how much your rights as a tenant can change based on where you live. And, maybe uncover some surprises along the way.
For sure, for sure.
Okay, so right off the bat, our sources are talking about this concept of tenant-friendly versus landlord-friendly states. Yeah.
For someone who's actually out there, trying to find a place to live, what does that actually mean for them? What are the real-world differences they might see?
Okay, so basically, when you hear tenant-friendly state, it generally means they've got laws that, offer renters more protection.
Okay, so more protection.
Well, more protection. Things like stronger rules about evictions, making it harder to get kicked out unfairly.
Oh, okay.
Stricter regulations on security deposits, so landlords can't just, hold on to your money for no reason.
Right.
And, clearer expectations for landlords to maintain the property, keep it livable.
Gotcha.
On the flip side, landlord-friendly states, well, it's kind of the opposite.
Right, I would assume.
Less regulation, more flexibility for landlords.
Which could mean less security for renters.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so can we get specific here?
Mm-hmm.
Based on what we're looking at, what are some states that stand out as being particularly tenant-friendly? So consistently, Vermont, Delaware, and Hawaii come up as the top tier.
Okay.
Hawaii especially has super strong eviction protections, very detailed rules about security deposits, and clear requirements for landlords to keep the property in good shape.
Wow, Hawaii sounds like a renter's paradise, at least legally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, cost of living is a whole other story.
Of course.
But yeah, legally, very tenant-friendly. California is another one that gets highlighted a lot, especially when it comes to rent control, preventing those crazy rent hikes.
Makes sense. California housing is notoriously expensive.
Yep. Then you have other states that often get mentioned as having strong tenant protections, like Maine, Alaska, Rhode Island, Michigan, Arizona.
Gotcha. So a decent spread across the country there.
Yeah.
And what about on the landlord-friendly side? Any states that really jump out from our sources?
Yeah, so you'll often hear Georgia, West Virginia, and Arkansas mentioned as being more, landlord-friendly, generally fewer regulations there, which, again, can mean renters have less security and fewer options if things go wrong. Our sources also point to states like North Carolina, Ohio, Colorado, Idaho, Louisiana, Wyoming, Mississippi, as tending to have laws that favor landlords more.
So, yeah, it's really all over the map. Just looking at this list, you can see how someone's experience renting could be totally different depending on where they are.
Yep, for sure.
All right, let's actually dive into some of the specific areas where these rights can differ so much. One that seems really fundamental is the whole idea of a landlord having to provide a safe and livable place.
Yeah, the warranty of habitability.
Right, that's the legal term for it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So for most states, what does that actually involve?
So the implied warranty of habitability basically means a landlord is legally obligated to make sure the rental is up to basic standards for safety and health.
Okay, so what kind of things are we talking about?
Things like working plumbing, heating, a roof that doesn't leak, no major structural problems, and no infestations.
Right, so the basic stuff you'd expect to have in a functional living space.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, our sources pointed out something pretty crazy about this.
Yeah, Arkansas.
What's up with Arkansas?
Arkansas is actually the only state in the entire U.S. that doesn't have an implied warranty of habitability.
Wait, so hold on. If you're renting in Arkansas, your landlord isn't legally required to provide a safe and livable home.
That's right.
Wow. What are the implications of that for renters?
I mean, it's a big deal, right?
I would think so.
It basically means renters, there could be living in conditions that would be completely unacceptable in almost every other state.
Right.
And they have very little legal recourse to force their landlord to fix things.
So even if their apartment is literally falling apart around them.
Yeah, it's a pretty extreme example of how much these protections can differ.
That's wild.
Okay.
Let's move on to something that's related to this, but a bit different. Maintenance and repairs.
Right.
So even in states that recognize this warranty of habitability, like, how do the rules vary when it comes to actually getting a landlord to, fix things that are broken?
Well, the details of like how quickly a landlord has to respond and what they're responsible for, that varies a lot. In more tenant-friendly states, you'll usually see clearer processes for tenants to report problems.
Okay.
And, stronger legal options if the landlord just ignores them.
Gotcha.
So, for example, some states might allow a tenant to withhold rent if a landlord doesn't make essential repairs after being notified.
That makes sense.
Or even take legal action to force the landlord to do the repairs.
Oh, wow.
But in states that are less tenant-friendly, renters might be stuck dealing with these issues themselves, and their options for getting the landlord to do something might be way more limited.
Right. And I mean, that directly affects the quality of life in that rental, right?
Absolutely. It's about basic safety and health.
Yeah. If you can't even get your landlord to fix a leaky roof or a broken heater, that's a huge problem.
Yep. Completely.
Okay. So another area where we see major differences is the whole eviction process.
Uh-huh.
What are some of the key variations that renters might run into there?
One of the biggest is whether a state has something called just cause eviction laws.
Just cause eviction.
Yeah. So in states with just cause eviction, a landlord actually needs a valid reason to evict someone.
Okay.
Like, not paying rent or violating the lease agreement.
Right. Makes sense.
This obviously gives tenants more security, knowing they can't just be kicked out for no reason.
Right.
But the thing is, most states don't actually have just cause eviction. They allow what's called at-will eviction.
At-will eviction, so no reason needed.
Pretty much.
Wow.
As long as the landlord gives the required notice, which can vary, they can usually end a month-to-month tenancy without a specific reason.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of, we don't want you here anymore, so you got to go kind of thing.
That seems pretty harsh for renters.
It can be, yeah. It's definitely a point of contention.
Interesting.
And then some states are trying to make the whole process fairer by requiring that eviction notices include information about how to get legal help.
Legal aid.
Yeah, because having a lawyer can make a huge difference in these situations.
Well, for sure.
Helps tenants understand their rights, navigate the court system, all that stuff.
Yeah, eviction court can be super intimidating.
Absolutely.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about something that's a big concern for a lot of renters, especially in more expensive areas: rent control.
Yeah.
So, how common are rent control policies across the U.S.?
Rent control, where there are limits on how much a landlord can raise rent.
Right.
It's not that common, actually.
Really?
Only certain states and cities have them.
Yeah.
And even then, the level of protection they offer varies a lot.
I gotcha.
But our sources do point to California, New York, and New Jersey as having some of the strongest rent control laws.
Okay.
So, in those places, tenants have more protection against those sudden, huge rent increases that can really make things tough.
Especially with how rents have been skyrocketing lately.
Exactly.
Okay, another big upfront cost for renters is that security deposit.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes getting it back can be a whole thing. How do state laws differ when it comes to those?
So the rules around security deposits usually cover things like the maximum amount a landlord can ask for.
Okay.
And how long they have to return it after you move out.
Right.
In tenant-friendly states, you'll often see stricter rules on both of those things.
Gotcha.
So limits on how much the deposit can be, clear guidelines on what deductions are allowed, and even penalties for landlords who don't return the deposit on time without a good reason.
So it's more about protecting the renter's money.
Exactly.
Now, what if a tenant actually knows their rights and tries to use them? Are there any protections against a landlord, retaliating against them?
Yeah, a lot of states do have laws against that. If you request repairs or report a code violation, your landlord isn't supposed to, punish you for it. But like most things we've talked about, the strength of those laws and how well they're enforced, it varies.
Right. Makes sense.
So, for example, if you report a problem and then your landlord suddenly decides to not renew your lease, that could be seen as retaliation.
Yeah, for sure.
But whether you can actually prove that and what the consequences for the landlord would be, that depends on the state.
Gotcha.
So some states have really strong protections, others not so much.
Okay. Now, our sources mention something called right to counsel in eviction cases, which sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
So what is that exactly?
Basically, it's like having the right to a lawyer in a criminal case, but for eviction court.
Oh, I see.
So in some states, if you're facing eviction, you're guaranteed to have legal representation.
Wow.
And that can make a huge difference in terms of, fairness.
I can imagine.
Because let's face it, most renters don't have the legal knowledge to go up against a landlord or a property management company in court. So having a lawyer there to help you understand your rights and make your case is really important.
Yeah, it levels the playing field a bit.
Exactly.
It seems like everything we're talking about really highlights this power imbalance between landlords and tenants.
Oh, for sure. And there's one aspect that our sources highlighted as being particularly harsh. It's the idea of facing criminal consequences for not paying rent.
Criminal charges, like going to jail for not paying rent.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right?
Yeah, that sounds extreme.
And you know what?
Wow.
Arkansas is the only state where that's a thing.
Seriously?
Seriously.
So in Arkansas, not paying your rent could land you in jail.
Yep. It really shows you just how far these differences can go.
That's pretty shocking, honestly. So I know we've talked about California a bit already and how it tends to be pretty tenant-friendly. Our sources also mention a law center in Santa Ana called the Martinez Law Center.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
They specialize in things like partition of sale of real property, partition in kind, and real estate fraud in Southern California. Their website is martinezlawcenter.com. And it just made me think, even in a state like California with strong tenant protections, you still need legal experts who understand the nuances of real estate law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because even with clear laws, disputes can still happen, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And both landlords and tenants can end up needing someone to help them navigate those complexities and make sure their rights are protected.
Exactly. Real estate law, it can get really complicated really fast.
So as we wrap this up, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for listeners when it comes to tenant rights across the U.S.?
I think the most important thing to remember is just how inconsistent those rights are. Like what you're entitled to as a renter, what protections you have, it can change drastically depending on where you live.
Right. And it really goes to show that it's crucial to understand the laws in your specific state.
Yeah.
Don't just assume that what applies in one state will be the same somewhere else.
Because it very likely won't be.
Yeah. All right. So listeners, as you're thinking about all this, here's a final thought. We've talked about how these differences can affect individual renters, but how do you think these varying laws might contribute to bigger societal issues?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Things like housing stability, affordability, even economic inequality.
Yeah, that's worth thinking about.
We really encourage you to look into the tenant laws in your own state or any state you might be considering moving to.
It's definitely worth the time.
Knowing your rights and how to exercise them is crucial no matter where you're renting.
For sure.
All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.